President, I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about why the events of the last 24 hours drive home how valuable it would be to have a House-Senate budget conference begin to meet and to deal with the extraordinary set of fiscal challenges our country has in front of us. And as the President of the Senate knows, a number of senators on our sides have been trying to get a budget conference with the House. It's been several months since the budget resolutions, the respective bodies have in effect been set in motion. And I want to talk about what's happened in the last 24 hours because it again drives home how valuable it would be for the Senate and the House to move to a budget conference at this time. Yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office, of course our official arbiter of budget numbers and trends, made public a new report showing that there has been a significant reduction in the budget deficit. In fact, their analysis shows that there's been something like a 24% reduction from what was estimated just a few months ago. Now, you couple that new evidence from the Congressional Budget Office with the fact that consumers continue to spend, which is certainly encouraging, the housing market coming back, employers adding 165,000 jobs in April. All of this drives home that in the short term, Mr. President, the economy is picking up and we're making real progress. The point of a budget resolution, on the other hand, is to give us a chance to look long-term, to look at the next 10 years, how Democrats and Republicans can come together, for example, on the long-term challenge of holding down health care costs. We have certainly seen progress, again, in the last few months on that. There's a debate about why health costs have been moderating of late. I happen to think it's because providers and others are beginning to see what's ahead, but we can have that debate, and certainly there is a lot more to do in terms of holding down health care costs for the long term. That's what I'd like to see the Senate and the House go to in terms of the budget resolution. For example, I think I've talked about it with the President of the Senate before, chronic care is where most of the Medicare money goes. This is for people with heart, stroke, diabetes, cancer, these kinds of challenges. We've got some ideas that we believe could be bipartisan, would be exactly the kind of thing the House and the Senate should take up in a conference on the budget, which we have been seeking for some time. And I only come to the floor today by way of trying to lay out why the events just of the last few days dramatize how useful it would be for the Senate and the House to start thinking about what the country really cares about, which is our long-term trends. In fact, this morning I was struck by the fact that some economic theorists say that the Congress has really, over the last few months, really had it backwards. We have been consumed with everything short-term, when in fact we ought to say, look at some of those positive developments that I just cited, including the Congressional Budget Office numbers here recently, that would indicate that maybe a little bit less of the back and forth and what certainly voters see as unduly partisan should give way to some thoughtful long-term efforts in sort of that 10-year window, which is really what's examined on the budget side. I would also point out, Mr. President, that some of the leading Republicans, some of the arch conservatives with respect to economic analysis are all saying the same thing, that we ought to be talking about long-term trends, which Democrats have said, and I cite again today, is a reason for a budget conference. Glenn Hubbard, for example, one of the most respected of the conservatives talks continually about the long-term challenge and the dangers, Mr. President, of waiting. Well, on this side of the aisle, we're saying we don't want to wait anymore in terms of getting a budget conference. We want to be in a position to tackle these major kinds of questions. Pro-growth tax reform that can, again, generate, revenue. And we have some ideas that we'd like to raise in a budget conference that we think would be attractive to the other side. So I hope that colleagues who have had questions about whether or not there ought to be a budget conference now, an actual budget conference between the Senate and the House, will look at these matters anew, given these kind of trends I would point out. And tell you the truth, I'm encouraged on this point. We've heard colleagues in the last few days on the other side of the aisle say, yes, they too think that this is time for an actual budget conference between the House and the Senate. They've called for it for a long time. We've now got a chance to not just call for it, but actually do it. And if anything, the economic news that I've cited suggests that some of the focus on these short-term, trends really ought to give way to more emphasis on bipartisan concern for the long-term trends, which are, in particular, going to revolve around health care, especially Medicare, and taxes, where we have an opportunity to look at bipartisan approaches for tax reform. And I commend particularly Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch, our leadership on the Finance Committee, on which I serve, who've been talking with senators in weekly sessions that they've pulled together on particularly the tax reform issue. So you couple, Mr. President, the opportunity for the long term, looking at things like chronic health care, which is where most of the Medicare dollar goes, where I think there are some good opportunities, protecting the rights of seniors while having quality care and holding costs down. Those are the things that you could really look at in the longer term, which is what a budget resolution, Mr. President, is really all about. So it's been 2 months since the House and Senate adopted their respective budget resolutions. I think, if anything, what we have learned in the last few days is yet more evidence why senators and House members of goodwill who want to tackle the long-term economic challenge, which, if anything, becomes increasingly important day by day, we ought to go to a budget conference and go forthwith to that effort in a bipartisan way. Later on in the morning, Mr. President, I intend to propound a unanimous consent request to, in fact, go to that conference with the House on the budget. And I would just urge colleagues, I know Senator Coburn is here, and I commend him because he's been one who's been interested in tackling long-term fiscal challenges. Long-term fiscal challenges, Mr. President, is what a debate between the House and the Senate over the next 10 years and the future trends that we're looking at are going to be front and center. We can tackle those questions, particularly on health care and taxes, by going to a conference looking at the long term. And we would also be, in my view, picking up on what economists and leaders in the private sector of both political parties are saying now, which is there should be a little bit less of a focus on short-term sparring about our economy and more of a focus on the long-term economic challenges, which is what a House-Senate budget conference looking at the 10 years ahead could be all about. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.